if we enhance our security architecture within the framework of the African peace and security architecture, and incorporate all these initiatives with the US and create some kind of a systemic approach whereby we are all looking at it from one perspective, I think we shall be moving forward.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru Njoroge. Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time. With nuance, with history, and with a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here. Today we turn to the Horn of Africa, one of the most complex security environments on the continent. This is a region where conflict rarely stays neatly within one border. War, displacement, trade, ports, peace agreements, maritime routes, external interests, and regional security all overlap. But this conversation is not only about conflict, it's about what comes after conflict. The difficult work of mediation, monitoring, implementation, trust building, and holding peace together when an agreement has been signed but the deeper fractures remain. To help us unpack that, I'm joined by Ambassador Major General retired Charles Tai Gituai, a Kenyan military officer, diplomat, and peace and security expert with more than 4 decades of service across defense, regional security cooperation, peace support operations, and conflict mediation. His experience cuts across RJMEC in South Sudan, AMISOM in Somalia, the East Africa Standby Force, senior command roles in the Kenya Defense Forces, and defense diplomacy. At the heart of today's conversation is a simple but difficult question. When war cannot solve the problem, what does it actually take to build and hold peace? Balozi, thank you so much for joining us on Panel 54. We have a tradition here. We would like to get to know who our guest is. So before we get into the South Sudan, Somalia, drones, peacekeeping, the Horn of Africa, I want to begin with the person behind the rank. All right. Now, you've worn many hats in different scenarios. What can we call you today? Do we call you Balozi? Do we call you Major General? Do we call you Mr. Gituai? Tai?
Well, I think Balozi will do.
Balozi will do?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stick with Balozi. I'm more comfortable with Balozi.
Okay.
So who is Charles Tai Gituai behind the military? Yeah. What early experiences in your life shaped your understanding of leadership, discipline, and service?
Thank you very much. First of all, personally, I'm happy that you invited me to this conversation here. I am basically son of a chief, and therefore right from the onset I could see my father in uniform. Mm-hmm. And I could be able to identify myself with uniform.
Right.
And therefore, as I was growing up, I could see him, it's a normal work with communities. And I got interested to have a job that is uniformed. And I was growing up also, I was also interested in physical fitness. And I used to walk long distance to go to school. And this enhanced my ability to start thinking about perhaps joining the forces.
Okay, and when your time in the Kenya Defense Force, how did that shape your worldview?
I think, as you know, military is an institution whereby you are focused to really fight external enemies. Mm-hmm. And as you train in the military, you'll be exposed to enemies that are external, not internal.
Right.
And this also makes you get interest, as part of the training, to begin to focus on what you call the external threat of your country. And this also makes you begin to understand the regional member states, and particularly the neighbors, so that you can be able to understand when you develop concepts, battle concepts, or what you call the battlefield exercises. They are conceptualized within the framework of the threat assessment. And these threats, of course, are assessed based on the neighboring countries. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've seen conflict from the command side, yes, the peace support side as well, and the mediation side. So there's 3 factors in there. And one of the strongest ideas in the brief is that war cannot continue for a very long time without resolving the real problem underneath it. So the underlying problem, basically. You have been quoted to say about Sudan, they could fight to the last man and it wouldn't solve the issue. What is that war? What is it that war cannot actually solve? Yeah, even when one side believes that it actually can win.
Well, one thing is that actually war is basically, we say war and peace are just, coin on both sides,
Sides,
is
yeah.
it? And war basically is actually the last resort of peace. If you fail to make peace, then you go to war. But actually, at the end of it, war does not solve the problem.
Okay.
Ultimately, what is important is to begin to focus on how do we identify at the very early stage what are the critical indicators that are likely to create this problem. And then you address those critical issues. If, for example, you're able to address a situation whereby you can be proactive in a situation. A case for South Sudan, for example, is a case where right from the onset, sorry, no, South Sudan,
Yeah.
the issue was about this disagreement between the two generals. And as a result of course, overthrowing the civilian government, the two generals sat to decide on how they can unify the country. And I remember the first framework of agreement, the issues that were brought about were 5 key issues. And among those 5 key issues was actually the issue of the security sector reforms, the transition justice, the focus on the Juba agreement that they had already discussed earlier, and also the need to think about the solution of the eastern side of the country. And more importantly, those 5 key issues, they had actually agreed upon. The only issue they could not agree on was actually the security reforms. And General Bohan, that particular time, as I understand, he wanted a quick fix in terms of unification of the forces. That is the unification of the RSF and the SAF forces. General Emeti Dagalo wanted the take longer time to unify his forces with his. And this was only one area of disagreement. They had agreed on the other 4, although that was, of course, a very early stage that they would have been able to resolve this problem before it escalated to where it was. So if the mediation would have been able to capture that moment and be able to address the issue of the unification of forces, or rather the security sector reforms, maybe perhaps we'll not be where we are.
Yeah.
Because the whole issue of the battle now, the contestation that they're having up to today, is caused as a result of inability to agree on the unification of forces. And you can see where we are now in the fighting. It has taken so long. The fighting now has reached a stage whereby it is difficult to even know whether they can actually agree to sit together, because right now General Emeti is controlling the entire area of Kordofan and Darfur. The President Buhan is controlling the eastern side and Khartoum. And when the generals of that level captures land and able to control some piece of the country, it becomes very difficult even to discuss peace, because they already have the issue of the advantage over what they are controlling.
Yeah.
And a particular country like Sudan, where each of those sides have resources. And therefore, even when you talk about peace at this point in time, it's going to be very difficult for them to agree to each one of them to play the second fiddle. And that is why it is important that the issue of Sudan is really taken at a higher level in terms of how it can be resolved.
Okay,
Yeah.
you're talking about peace, and I'm looking at the situation you've just described. We're going to expand on that a bit later, but you've also described the war in Sudan as a failure of mediation, right? So when mediation fails, what has usually gone wrong?
In most issues, that mediation requires a lot of patience and a lot of, involving more participants in this peace process. And as you know, for the case of the Sudan, first of all, the center of gravity in this would actually be the civilian issue, the civilian population, which were not involved in the peace discussions. And it will be difficult to actually talk about peace when you do not have a strategy in terms of how you expect the success or the outcome of it. And the most critical issue was that the interventions by the international community, which now brought a lot of confusion in this process. And again, the issues of the interest in terms of the resource competition. And the countries that were coming on board, they had seen an opportunity now where they can exploit the resources. And as a result, they would like to see how best they can deal with who in this belligerent team who can give them advantage over the resources. It becomes more complicated. And this is now the situation we are in Sudan.
Okay. I'm looking now to shift gears to the really hard part in terms of if we have a situation where something has been signed. But looking at peace agreements as a general rule, they're usually treated as endpoints, right? Leaders will shake hands, but in many cases, signing the agreement is only the beginning of a much, much harder process. So I'd like to know from you, from your experience now with South Sudan and RJMEC, why is implementation often harder than actual negotiation?
In the case of South Sudan, for example, they agree that they need to work on, and the formation of all the leaders from the political level, members of parliament, ministers, all the way up to the level of the state levels, even the state formation in terms of having 10 states from what was before 32 and 28 states, was saw as a result of the implementation of the agreement. So the government that is sitting in Juba today is actually created by this agreement. So which means they are legitimized by the agreement. And therefore, they cannot claim to be anything else that is legitimate outside the agreement. Then they are supposed now to come up and begin to work on the issues of the unification of forces, security sector reforms, bring about all the forces that were fighting together, make one military, make one police, make one intelligence service, and so on and so forth. This is what was very fundamental, because if you bring the belligerents, all the forces that were fighting to make one force, then you are beginning now to build the country.
Yeah.
This again has not been able to be achieved. Then, of course, they were also supposed to come up with issues regarding the humanitarian aspects in terms of settling the refugees, settling the IDPs, be focusing on the rural people and being able to see how they can manage them. Then, of course, we have to come up with the issues regarding the resource economic management, be able to see how they manage the oil resources, non-oil resources, finances, sharing of resources between the center and periphery, and also come up with the policies that will govern the management of the central bank and the resource management, so on and so forth. All those are already identified in the agreement, and they agreed on exactly how they will need to do to come up to that. And then also they were to also come up with the transition justice, which was to bring about the issues regarding how they'll deal with the issues of the criminals that were there, the truth, reconciliation, and the healing, issues regarding the reparations, how they're going to pay those, compensate those who were injured, and so on and so forth. All those things were identified in the agreement and the procedures on how to do them. And then finally, the other final chapter was now to come up with a new constitution. And this new constitution is upon which the elections were supposed to be based on. Because most of the root causes of the war were basically identified as those 6 key issues that they needed to rectify so they can now be able to resolve the situation and be able now to have elections. But unfortunately, it has been very difficult to implement all those things, apart from the government, which was, of course, established, and it is there, legitimized by the agreement. But then they are unable to know how to manage the issues, particularly which is very critical of the unification of forces. It's been a big challenge. The troops were not able to be unified. And as a result of that, we started now having these difficulties of fightings between the forces themselves out in the periphery, where the forces of the opposition were neglected. They were not able to come to the constitutional camps to be trained. There were challenges of salaries to be paid to these forces. And as a result, of course, now, as you know, today, the first vice president, who is one of the principals, is already in detention.
Yep.
And this, again, now has brought a lot of problems in terms of how to move forward. So in my view, I think what I could say is that there wasn't political will in terms of the implementation of the agreement. There wasn't a commitment to this, and there was suspicion and trust deficit between the leaders to be able to think about how they can best deal with this situation so that they can move forward. And in my view, the leadership of South Sudan, this is an opportunity. To me, as a former chair, I would want to state here that this agreement is one of the most transformative framework for South Sudan peace process. And in the absence of implementing this agreement, South Sudan is likely to get to some very difficult situations going forward, because the international community may not be there again to bring up another another agreement. The first agreement collapsed 2015, 2016. This is a second agreement. I don't think there will be room for
another one.
For another one.
So now we're going to move from South Sudan now and look up and look at the Horn of Africa. All right. One of the challenges with the Horn of Africa is that crises do not behave normally. I don't know which crisis would behave normally, or they don't behave neatly, in other words. A conflict in one place can affect borders, it can affect trade, it can affect refugees, it can affect ports, it can affect maritime routes and regional trust as well as security operations in another place. Yeah, so one effect here creates a different effect over here. When you look at the Horn of Africa as a connected security environment, what makes peace building in this region so difficult?
I think the security geography of the Horn of Africa is basically connected to the issues regarding the geopolitics of the Red Sea, the issues regarding the control of the Red Sea itself, and also the internal politics and internal conflicts of the regional countries. Mm-hmm. And cumulatively, you begin to see that the region has serious internal conflicts within itself, and at the same time it is connected, and every internal conflict is connected to the neighbor in terms of this transitional countries differences. If, for example, you take a case of Sudan itself, for example, you come back to Sudan, you see that Sudan, despite the situation they are in now, South Sudan has due to export its oil through Sudan.
Yes.
Despite that there is a war in Sudan. And this oil has to be transported up to the Red Sea. The Red Sea is in of course, that very volatile artery. And if there is problems in the Red Sea, it will mean that it affects even a country like South Sudan, which is very far from the Red Sea anyway. And these are some of the situations that you begin to find that they cumulatively they are interconnected. If you look at the situation, for example, even in a country like Ethiopia, with its own internal problems that it is having now, at the same time, connecting that into what is going on in Sudan itself, they have a difference in terms of their issues regarding the border. The issue of the River Nile also connecting Egypt all the way through to Sudan and also part of Ethiopia. The issues regarding the Renaissance Dam in terms of the water, the dam and the water that Egypt wants to control for its own survival. So all these things are interconnected and they create some tensions within the region. And this is part of the problem that actually this region of the Horn of Africa has.
Okay, then the Horn has repeatedly produced movements built around autonomy, identity, self-determination, and separation. So what conditions make people stop believing that the state can actually hold them fairly?
Well, in terms of the issues of the range, the Horn of Africa, you find that the region itself has its own historical background, which is different from most of other regions. If you look at the historical situation of a country like, for example, Ethiopia, you find that Ethiopia was not colonized.
No.
And therefore, its internal politics are different. And again, it is formed through what we would call the ethnic federalism, which is different from what perhaps is how a country like Kenya is, or even a country like Somalia. Somalia has its own issues regarding the clan dynamics that are at play there. And also, if you look at also the issues regarding how these countries have been formed, the breakaway of the Sudan from the Sudan itself as a result of the subjugation of the South Sudan, the issues regarding the politics of colonial politics that created the boundaries between, for example, the what I would call the British Somaliland and the Italian Somaliland. Of course, Eritrea, which again was more like Italian, which broke away from the Sudan, and all these dynamics come to play in this region, and you can also see now in Somalia itself also again what's going on in terms of the Jubaland and the Puntland and the dynamics that are at play there, the issues regarding the federal member states and the federal government of Sudan, disagreements between the states because of resource sharing, issues regarding deployments, issues regarding leadership, issues regarding inability to have the center holding because of the individual state interests. So all those cumulatively have been a cause of the conflict in the region.
Okay. You mentioned Kenya, and I want to bring Kenya into this conversation right now. Yeah. But I'm going to bring it in from a military and institutional perspective, as it were. Kenya is close enough to regional instability to be affected by it, but we also have enough experience to contribute to peace support, right? We also contribute to defense diplomacy, and we'll also look at security operations, is where we're currently parked. So Kenya has historically basically played a significant role in the regional peace support, right? Again, I'm going to mention defense diplomacy, security operations. Now, from a military and institutional perspective, what should Kenya continue strengthening if it is to remain a credible regional peace and security actor?
Kenya needs to focus on defense diplomacy, which is very important in this region. We also need to focus on economic diplomacy as part of enabling the regional unification in terms of regional integration. And what we need to put the effort into is focus on integration in terms of how we can be able to see how we can share resources, how we can develop together. And this is important because if we want to, for example, help the situation in the Somali, we need to be able to see how best we can be able to have some kind of relationships based on trade, on business, and also relations based on shared intelligence in terms of if you're talking about terrorism or counter-terrorism. We need to establish those networks. We need to revive, for example, the pact that we used to have with Ethiopia. I'm not sure whether it was revived. They used to have a security pact with Ethiopia. We are very much, I think, connected to Uganda in terms of our relations and the security relations. We don't need to keep on quarreling on things that we can resolve. For example, if it is the issue of the Kenya-South Sudan border, I remember there was debates about the construction of the road between Nadapa and Nadako. I think we can separate development with security. If, for example, there's a dispute along the border, that should not stop development. I think you can go along, do the roads, and then, of course, whatever may be outcome where the border is, I think it is insignificant in the sense that if you're talking about integration, then we should not be very much worried about borders. And that brings me to also the point of even relationship between, for example, kind of like Ethiopia and even Djibouti or even with the Somaliland. The critical issue here should be the focus on how best can we be able to bring about development, how we can be able to bring about trade and investment rather than focusing only on our differences. And this is what should be really the emphasis should be on our similarities, not our differences. And I think that would help us to move forward.
You mentioned relationships, and you also mentioned the aspect of terrorism information and counterterrorism networks and things like that. I was looking at probably, closer to home, obviously, is Kenya-US relationships in terms of support for maritime, for land support and everything like that. What can countries within the Horn of Africa learn from the kind of successful security operations that Kenya and US have had?
Yes, indeed. Kenya has very good relations with the U.S. in terms of even defense relations. We've a very good defense cooperation with the U.S. Recently, there was a nexus that was conducted in Mombasa, which was very successful on counterterrorism, and this is what is needed. Kenya also has been recently, you recall that even we've signed another cooperation with the French forces, and of course the British forces are always here in this country. This is not about anything else but actually enhancing your security framework and being able to gain in terms of intelligence sharing, information sharing, technology sharing, and also being able to have this exposure internationally. And this also brings you to the fact that if Kenya is successful, and why it is successful even in some of these United Nations missions, is because the troops have been exposed to these interactions with these international forces, and they have learned to work in the culture of multicultural environment, multinational environment, and multidimensional environment. And this is very important if you want to succeed in the dynamics of the world peace. And the countries can learn from us in the sense that the success of Kenya is purely based on their ability to be able to have this exposure, to be able to have this experience, and to be able to have this refined training that focuses at a global level, whereby you can employ a Kenyan soldier or a Kenyan officer anywhere in the world, and you would fit within the framework because of the exposure they have.
Okay, you mentioned technology. I'm going to come to that towards the end, but I want to come back to your experience with AMISOM, where you were based in Somalia, right? And you actually had a senior operational role in AMISOM as well. What did that mission teach you about multinational military operations and the realities of peace support rather, in Africa?
Well, yes, I served in Somalia as a deputy force commander, and also I also served again in Sierra Leone as a chief of staff of the deputy chief of staff of the mission there in Sierra Leone. One thing about the UN missions is that first of all, at the command level, you learn to work with, as I mentioned, with the multinational, multicultural, and the multidimensional forces. And this is important because you'll be working with these countries from all over the world. For example, I was a commander of forces that were coming from Burundi, from Uganda, from Djibouti, from Ethiopia. And of course, with their dynamics and their doctrines, you need to understand how to work with those forces. And what you learn is that you need to be very patient. You learn the values of neutrality, the values of impartiality, the values of the command, ability to be able to deal with all their issues, ability to be able to interact even at the civilian level. You also deal with the civil society. You deal with the people, the local communities, and the local leaders. You deal with the government of Somalia. At a very high level, you'll be able to also be interacting with the SRCC, that is the boss of the civilian boss of the African Union Commission, and also the leadership of the country. So it gives you a perspective in terms of how you interact at a very high level, and this helps you master the aspect of the political dynamics and the peace dynamics. The challenges that are there in these commands is that sometimes, despite having all these diverse forces that you are commanding, you find that the mission itself, like the peace mission in Somalia, Somalia is a very large country. And the forces that you are given, they may not be enough to occupy all the spaces. And secondly, also, you find that the resources are scarce in terms of how you can be able you may have your plans on how you tend to deploy, but you are limited by the scarcity of the resources.
Yeah.
And you have to find out how you can maximize or do what you call achieve the mostest with the leastest, if that is English. And you are able also to begin to think about how you can actually ensure that you achieve your objectives. Sometimes you have a very big mandate, and that big mandate sometimes becomes a challenge for you to achieve because of the resources limitations. Secondly, also, you begin to see that sometimes the forces that you are commanding, this is a challenge you find, for example, like in a place like Somalia, where you have neighboring countries having provided the forces. One of the challenges I used to have is that there's a lot of interference from the leadership of these forces. For example, CDFs of some of those forces would call the forces directly. And, the chain of command should be right from the commander himself to his troops down there. And these interferences sometimes can actually make it very difficult for you, because sometimes you can issue orders and sometimes they are compared with the respective home country to see whether it's adequate for them to undertake these things. And this was one of the things that I think was a big challenge in this mission. But the lessons learned is that in every situation you are in these peace missions, I think you should be people-centric in terms of how do you help the people of the country? How do you achieve peace? How are you able to win the hearts and minds of the people so that at least you can be able to say, yes, I was here and this is what we achieved, despite the challenges.
Okay, I'll just ask this very quickly and then we can move on. Are African standby and peace supporting mechanisms built for speed and complexity of today's crisis?
Yes, standby forces. Apparently, I happen to have been the Joint Chief of Staff of the Eastern Africa Standby Force. And this is basically replicated all over within the African peace and security architecture. I'm sure you are aware that we have the Southern African,
yes,
and of course Western African and Central African and so on and so forth. In our region, which is a bit peculiar, is that we have the Eastern Africa Standby Force, which is a 10-member state, and it is stationed in Nairobi as a political headquarter, and Addis Ababa as a military headquarter. And I was in Nairobi because I was Joint Chief of Staff here. And what you find is that the challenges that we have in these organizations is that there is some lack of homogeneity in terms of mobilization. If, for example, in our region, the members of the Eastern Africa Standby Force are 10, and this 10 is Eastern Africa, which includes, of course, Ethiopia. Additional to IGAD, it is Ethiopia, there is Djibouti, there is, of course, Comoros and Seychelles. And some of these members, even Rwanda is there, and even Burundi. And some of these members are not actually members of IGAD, because IGAD is the anchor of the peace and security of the region. So the dynamics that come about is that some of these countries that are not within IGAD, and they are part of the concept of the standby force, you begin to see challenges when it comes to mobilization, command and control, because they are also not part of the center headquarter. And this is a peculiar situation in our region. It's not there in ECAS in Central Africa. It's not there in SANDC. It's not there in ECOWAS or ECOMOG, for that matter, or even in Maghreb, which now is not really functioning. So this is the African peace and security architecture, which has set these 5 regions. And the idea of this was after the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where the regions were expected to establish forces that can be deployed quickly in a country to curb a situation before the movement of the forces like either African Union forces or even UN forces. I think in our region here, there was one time we were about to get involved in Burundi when there was some problem, but I think it was resolved at a political level. The idea is very good in terms of trying to be able to be the first line forces to curb the situation. But the challenges, of course, are resources.
Yeah.
Secondly, also, funding is a big problem. Most of these are actually funded by external funders. And this also brings another challenge, because when you depend on external funders, then they will be calling the shots on
you become beholden to them. And this is something that really has challenged all of us, not only in this region, but also even in other regions of Africa. Okay. Yeah. I wanted to mention about technology. Now, drones, right, and battlefield technologies are changing the conduct of war at a very different kind of level. But can they change how peace is actually made?
And drones is a technology that now we are getting into. I think we cannot run away from technology everywhere in the world. That is the way forward. In peacekeeping, drones will be essential in terms of what you call the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
Okay.
And they would actually be a force multiplier, and particularly when it comes to deploying them to be the foresight for what we call the observers. They will be able to throw a drone out there to observe for them than getting there. That, of course, is very, very important. They are also essential in terms of course, collecting this intelligence. If you've drones that can be able to digitize and be able to compute information and intelligence, that would be also very important. And this is part of what going forward will be useful to these UN missions. The challenge with drones is that they have been destructive in many places because they are cheap and affordable, and they have a huge destruction. They can damage. They have done a lot of damage. I'm sure you know this about in Sudan, in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But we cannot run away from technology. What we know is that despite all this, drones cannot take over the hardware. Drones may destroy tanks, they may destroy ships, but they cannot take over those. You need those equipment. You need that hardware. They cannot replace a human soldier, because the soldier will capture ground. Drones, you never hold terrain. soldiers will have to be there to hold terrain. So to me, drones is actually a force multiplier like any other equipment out there in the battlefield.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you were to advise the next generation of African defense partners, what would you tell them to prioritize now before the next conflict exposes a gap?
I think more importantly, I think it's technology. You need to have these young men now be able to understand about the AI, artificial intelligence. They need to understand about what you've just been talking about these drones, and also the future wars. The future wars are going to be fought in space. Future wars are going to be fought maybe in a not necessarily like a traditional fight that we've been fighting before. They need to be very advanced in terms of being able to read situations very early. And I think what is important is, first of all, to understand whether we can be proactive rather than reactive.
Will that then have to deploy the likes of diplomacy first before you start doing...
You need to understand the indicators of a threat. And then once you're able to... I think intelligence is very important. If you're able to evaluate situations before they escalate and deal with them at the very early stage so that you don't have... By the way, we can stop wars if we really work with intelligence and be able to be reactive and be able to be proactive and resolve issues before they grow big. As I just mentioned, if you have to go back, for example, the situation I mentioned about the Sudan situation.
Yeah.
You see, if there could have been a possibility of modalities of discussing on how the RSF and SAF would unite the forces, because the critical issue was that issue regarding the security sector reforms, unification of RSF and SAF. If that was addressed, even if it was a challenge that maybe President Buhan wanted to be done in 2 years, RSF commander wanted to be done in 10 years, which of course was a bit difficult and to wait for 10 years to unite the forces. Maybe there could have been some modalities of agreement or some kind of a win-win situation. We should have brought the agreement that we can have either 5 or 4 or whatever.
But fix this one first, at least.
Yes. I think the fact that perhaps the whatever caused the breakdown of the talks up to where we are now, I think you can imagine. So I think if we begin to think in the direction of proactive diplomacy, where you are able to deal with issues, read situations and react before they develop to these kind of levels, I think we can save the world.
Okay. Yeah. Now, Balozi, as we bring this conversation to a close, I want to bring you back to the aspect of leadership, hope, and legacy, basically. You've been in this game for more than 4 decades. Yeah. What still gives you hope about Africa's security future?
Well, the hope for Africa's security future is basically the potential that Africa has. As we sit here, we know Africa, of course, is going to double its population by year 2050. I think for every 4 human beings, I think 1 will be an African in the world. And I think the value of youth is very, very important in this country. For example, you look at the population now, I think the majority of the people are actually less than probably 35 years of age. And we need to think about how do we look into how we can develop this capacity. The focus should be on the human resource development. Education is key if we really want to have a future for our countries. We need to have good education for our youth. We need to have our health systems. We need to work out on issues regarding the structures that will bring about employment, infrastructure. We need to create jobs for the youth. We need to create industries. We need to really focus on how we can manage our natural resources. Because one of the greatest problems we are having in Africa is that we export raw materials and we are not able to add value to them, and we end up getting very little. So if we can focus in that direction, and more importantly, all the policies should be youth-centric in the sense that decisions that we make must be based on futuristic approach in terms of how the young people will come to take over, to be able to see an environment that we created that is good for them. And this is not only even in the military, it of course is elsewhere in all areas of walks of life. And unless really we think in that direction, it's going to be very difficult for us as Africans to be able to move forward. And if we also need to get out of this aspect of always looking to be assisted. We need to begin to see how we can help ourselves. When we talk about African solutions, African problems, African solutions, what is the practicability of that? How do we bring that to our own so that we can be able to work on it in regard to what we mean by that? And if I, for example, take an example of, say, for example, what now Ethiopia is talking about wanting to have to enter Somaliland, to have a base there, and it is stopped by it's stopped by Somalia, and then you begin to know that UAE also is able to access Port of Berbera, but not Ethiopia. So you ask yourself, if UAE can enter Berbera, of course, because of their strategic interest in the region, why would Ethiopia have a problem? And it's an African country. If Ethiopia, for example, wants to enter the port of Assab, and then it becomes a problem from Eritrea, because Eritrea feels that they don't want to have this country that they fought with, what would be the problem of having this issue being taken over by the regional peace and security architecture within the framework of African Union or even IGAD to discuss on the benefits of that, on a win-win approach? Because ultimately, if you look at a country like Ethiopia with a population of 130 million people, with a youth that are about 68 million, population of that country is below the age of 35. Of course, President Abiy will be focused to ensure that he sees that this population of the future has a stable country, has an ability to access the resources from the outside. And bottling, to me, is strategic in terms of trying to get out of being landlocked. And these are the things that are important if we as Africans begin to think about how do we look at our problems and look for solutions rather than resorting to conflict. Can we be able to address an issue and see the benefits of it in terms of how we can benefit out of it, rather than how we can fight not to have it?
Yeah,
I think that to me would be important.
Okay, in terms of what you mentioned about future-proofing, basically looking at how we can move forward and try and avoid certain conflicts before they actually happen, how much can we then look at using the USA cooperation in terms of now really amplifying security cooperation, defense cooperation, aspects of training? How would we be able to leverage on the current success but make it augment that US relationship with, outside of Kenya, with other African countries who need that kind of support to be able to cover those three key areas?
If we enhance our security architecture within the framework of the African peace and security architecture, and incorporate all these initiatives with the US and create some kind of a systemic approach whereby we are all looking at it from one perspective, I think we shall be moving forward, where we don't look at who is supporting who for what purpose, but can we be able to enhance the whole issue and bring it in coherence in a way that we can be able to advance it for the benefit of us all, and look at it in terms of what is our benefit. I think the challenge that we have sometimes that when we also go to these agreements, sometimes we don't look at these partnerships, whether we are partnering to benefit or we are partnering as dependents. I think we need to really be able to very quickly antagonize that and be able to see, are we benefiting? And then this benefits has to be, if it is security, if it's the US that is training.
So what would a partnership with the USA that was beneficial to us look like?
It should be, for example, if it's a question of counterterrorism,
okay,
then we should be able to know that we are training to be able to protect our interests in terms of not being attacked by terrorists. And that has to do also, it cannot be an isolated arrangement.
Right.
It has to do with a holistic approach with Sudan, with Somalia, with Uganda, with Tanzania, because basically the threats are within us. And we cannot have an isolated security arrangement of counterterrorism when Somalia is not part of it in terms of course, with the porosity of the borders. We need to know how do we manage this, whereby if you're talking about entry into Kenya, how do you control this? If you're talking about issues regarding management of the entry points, how do you manage this? If you're talking about scrutiny and all these things that we do, how do we then able to work in a cohesive approach that will help us in totality rather than as an isolated country. So,
and that's
why
another place where technology there can become a multiplier from that effect.
Absolutely. Technology is a part of it. And also, again, that's why I'm saying these security frameworks or architectures, they have to be incorporated. If you're talking about 10 member states of the African East African Standby Force region, or what you call the ECAS or whatever that is there out, then you need to have all these groups working, or these states working together with a coherent approach that will be able to agree on the way forward on dealing with these issues of terrorism. We need to have shared resources or intelligence, for that matter. We need to have centralized approaches that will be able to help us, so that we are able to if there's movement of say terrorists in Comoros, we should be able to know in Nairobi or in Mogadishu, for that matter. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What leadership lessons should young Africans, in terms of African officers, diplomats, and peace builders, never forget?
I think the critical issue is integrity, very important, because without integrity, you will not be able to really function. The issue of character and development is very important, that you need to be able to understand that good character, and you say character is what you do when you are not being seen, is very important. The issues of patriotism is very important, because again, if you're not patriotic as a diplomat, you're not be able to project your country's interest or even your country's foreign policy. And also, you need to be able to understand the communities that you are working with, the staff that you are working with, value each person, and be able to interact fully and be able to use the expertise of every person that you're working with, and be able to have to be a team player, so that you're able to focus and be able to produce results in accordance with what you want.
Okay, I'm going to take you back slightly. There's something I just remembered I wanted to ask you, and I missed it. Now, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden are basically no longer just shipping routes, right? They're strategic pressure points that link African security, global trade, and external competitive power, right? How would African states think about maritime security when the waters around them are becoming more contested? And also, from that perspective, we'll be looking at the aspect of Al-Shabaab, which has always been a thorn in our sides. How are we then looking at dealing with that, especially, again, if we're looking at cooperative security frameworks? We've seen various attacks, at least in this country, that were linked to Al-Shabaab. And again, it was a cooperation with the United States. I think the Israelis were brought in as well, that helped us now trying to get back on our feet, or at least now stopped situations where that could have occurred again. So we're looking at two aspects there in terms of how the Red Sea can become less contested if we have security measures in place. And now the threat of Al-Shabaab, whether it's still as predominant as it was before, or whether the fact that now we have good security frameworks and partnerships with the likes of the USA that would allow us to then say we have something in place that can now be used as a model to be used in other African countries.
Well, the strategic issues regarding Red Sea, first of all, Red Sea is a very critical artery for the international community. The Red Sea is where we have about 10% of global trade passing through. The Red Sea is where we have about almost 1/3 of the world's container shipping goes through. The Red Sea is actually the connection between Europe and Asia. And therefore, Red Sea is an area of interest at a very high level. And even as much as we as Africa, we would want to have a say in the Red Sea, the international community is already there, because they are the main transporters of this shipping, movement of goods and services. And that's why you find that it is we have the Chinese there, we have the Russians there, we have the Americans there. They have established bases, in Djibouti now. We have almost about 5 countries in Djibouti. We are having also Russia trying to come on board through the port of Sudan. We are looking at also Eritrea, which has about 1,200 kilometer border of the Red Sea beach, which they are also beginning now to see it from the value of how it can be useful in terms of establishing bases there. I think they have also been approached by other international countries, even Russia, they have approached them. So the thing is that because of the nature of the Red Sea and it is a strategic importance, obviously the players always will be the international countries, and being the access to the Indochina access up to the Pacific. So it is not an area that we as African countries, we also need to see how can we have a share of this. And I think that is where you begin to see the interest that now we are having with the Somaliland, for example. The Berbera port is attracting the UAE. You see the port of Bosaso, which is an import land, is also attracting the international shipping. It's also, we are beginning to hear ASAP now, it's also beginning to create interest. I mentioned also Ethiopia is beginning to get interested now to have access to the Red Sea. And again, because of the war in the Sudan now, also the port of Sudan has also created interest. Russians are interested in that port. And therefore, if you look at the entire geography of that region, you begin also to see even Saudi Arabia, which also has a long beach line along the ocean. It has begun to construct a city called Naum City, which is just opposite the Sharm el-Sheikh. And because they also want to attract business from the Red Sea, of course, even Egypt itself, which is actually the main manager of the Suez Canal, they have begun also to expand the Suez Canal. So you can see even the threat that has been created by the war in Iran and the port of Hormuz that now, the Strait of Hormuz that is now having a problem. The international community has realized much more the value of the Red Sea in terms of the transportation. In the absence of the Red Sea, you'll have to do the Cape of Good Hope, which is a very long distance, very expensive. So the countries that are bordering this Red Sea are really very strategic in terms of how they will be able to also exploit that particular issue. I think Djibouti has been able to be very transactional in terms of the business that it has established there. I think those countries support the economy of Djibouti. I believe Somaliland is also beginning to see the importance of this, and probably that is why there are tensions now between Somaliland and the Somali itself, because they begin to see that the interest that is creating to attracting the international community. And for the African countries, it will always be an area that will always be managed or controlled by this international countries, international community, because of its strategic importance.
If I was to look at somebody like China, who you said has an interest in ports and things like that, from our perspective, in terms of at least what we have seen with other countries, there is a semblance of looking after the good of the welfare of the people in the countries. If I look at somebody like China, whose main push for soft power is very economic, is their base setting up actually in the best interest of the people who are surrounded, who are affected, or is it purely a money-making venture?
Well, first of all, it is strategic to the country. For example, China is trying to protect its ships that are passing through the Gulf of Aden, through the Babel de Mandeb there, through the Red Sea. China is interested to protect its ships that are passing through there. Remember, we are talking about goods moving from all the way through to Europe. And also China is, you remember, if you look at the history, the geography of the world, you see that most of the goods from China pass through the Gulf of Malacca, that is between Singapore and Malaysia. And, that Gulf of Malacca is actually secured by Americans who are in Singapore and South Korea and Japan. So China would be a little bit worried, because that looks like a strategic vulnerability for them. And they would want to find a route out of that. And I believe, as I know now, China also beginning to see how they can access through construction of a mobility corridor through Pakistan to the sea. And this is strategic for them. So for them to be in Djibouti is purely their own protection of their goods and services. Remember, of course, they are in Africa. They have invested heavily in Africa. They would want to be close by in the event of any kind of interventions. Secondly, also because of the international contestations that are there and the international community that are there. For example, there is Japan there, there is the Americans are there, the French are there, also the Russians are now coming by. I think China, as a power, will not want to be out of the game. More importantly, Djibouti itself, I think it is just transactional. It is getting paid by those countries that have the port there. So Djibouti has no resources. So to them, they are just getting financed by renting those spots. Which to me, I think for them that's strategic issue that's there. What is worrying is that the African Union does not seem to have a say in terms of these deployments. Although, of course, the deployment of these forces in Djibouti threatens the whole of Africa in terms of the forces being close to us. But the African Union does not have a say. And now this brings the issues of sovereignty. Yeah. Does Djibouti need to ask permission from the African Union to invite anyone in its country? And these are the dynamics that come into play, where it comes now to the African inability to be able to work in a cohesive manner. And this is what I was saying earlier, that I think we need to really have our regional communities, integrate so that they can be powerful. I was also thinking about, for example, if you look at our region, the East African, we have the East African community, which has about 7 members now, including Congo. Then we have IGAD, which also has other members. There are members of IGAD that are not members of East African community, and vice versa. If you look at the 5 African architecture, peace and security architecture framework, SADC is intact. If you go to West Africa, ECOWAS, ECOWAS is intact. ECA, Central Africa is intact. Of course, Maghreb has their own problems. But we in our region, we seem to have 2 competing institutions. We have the East African community, and we have the IGAD. And then we have the Great Lakes region. And then we have other small lake basin and so on and so forth. Then we have the COMESA that runs all across the eastern region. So when it comes to, for example, the security, peace and security organ, each of these small organizations have a peace and security organ. And they are all addressing the same issues. Yeah. If it is Congo, Great Lakes are addressing Congo, East African communities are addressing Congo. Maybe IGAD comes on board because Uganda is there. So you begin to see that we first of all spread the resources. And those who fund us also, they fund those little organizations, splitting whatever funding that they'll be having. Maybe perhaps we need to put our game together. Pull everything together. We need to perhaps establish an Eastern Africa community, Eastern Africa, which would include perhaps more countries, including even the Comoros, including even Seychelles. Perhaps you look at, for example, now countries like Tanzania has a foot in SADC, has a foot in East African community. Congo has a foot in East African community, has a foot in Central Africa, has a foot in SADC. And then Burundi is there. It's not clear whether they're in East African community or they're in SADC or in ECAS. So we need really, I don't know, it's my thinking, that we could perhaps begin to think about how we can reconstruct some of these institutions to be able to focus more in terms of putting the resources together. Even when we seek international funding, we're able to get funded as a holistic institution instead of these shared resources in institutions.
Fragmentation.
Yes. Yeah. So it's something that perhaps we could think about in terms of how as we talk about unification, as we talk about integration, as we talk about shared resources in this time when the world economy is collapsing or is going down. So what is it that we can do in our region to be able to think in that direction, to be able to see how we can be more productive?
And have some kind of resilience anyway at the end of it. So now I'd like to finish with this question. How would you like your service and contribution to peace and security to be remembered?
Well, I would like to say that I, at a personal level, I think what I would want to reflect is the work that I did in Somalia. I think I've also been able to work in South Sudan to be able to bring peace in that country, despite that the situation is the way it is. But the critical issue and focus now, I think the world or the Africa should focus on how we can actually resolve the problem in Sudan. I think that should be on the top of the agenda because the human suffering in that country is severe. We need to see how Africa, if it is either African Union or IGAD, working together with those countries that have leverage, like the US, like Egypt, like UAE, even China, if it is possible, to really have a deliberate approach to resolve the situation in Sudan. I think to me that is key. The other one is how we can be able to resolve the situation of the Somali situation, where now we have a serious division of federal member states and government and the federal government in terms of how we can address the political situation. I think most of the developments inside Somalia have more or less been focused on military developments. Of course, we know Turkey has been there doing a lot of work on the military, doing a lot of work on infrastructure and development and so on and so forth. But I think there's need to refocus on how now we can actually help that country in terms of how they can have a political focus on relations between the federal member states and the government and the federal government to come up with an agreement on how they can move forward in their country. The other issue that we can probably think about is the South Sudan itself, which in my view have been there for quite some time. That South Sudan may need, already now, they have African Union has appointed President Kikwete to be in charge of the focus on the implementation of the peace agreement and the way forward on the elections. I think we need to have regional support. We need President Kikwete to be supported by the region. We need to perhaps be able to see much more focus on his team that he is being given by the African Union, how they can be strengthened in terms of either capacity or financing or whatever it is that they may need to be able to help that country. Because if we do not succeed in the South Sudan peace process at this point in time, this is again another issue that I would say here. We might be talking about inability to have acted proactively when that country goes to war again.
Which brings us back to the beginning of our conversation.
So this is the time that we can support President Kikwete in whatever help or whatever strength so that he can succeed now that he has been given that responsibility. And then, of course, looking at the overall issue regarding what perhaps Ethiopia would want to access the Red Sea. I think also this is something that can be discussed at the level of the IGAD or African Union, because in my view, looking at the strategic aspect as a regional IGAD members, Ethiopia is a very critical country in the IGAD with the population that I mentioned and with the youth batch that is coming up. I think to be able to be proactive to stop future wars, we need to think about how can we help Ethiopia access the sea so that they can be able to ventilate towards its trade and commerce. And with such a largest population that is landlocked in the world, I don't know if you're aware of this.
Yeah.
And how do we manage going forward? Because even if it's not now, it will happen.
It will come, yeah.
And it will come maybe at a time when it will be bloody. Why can we not do it now? These are the kind of things I'm talking about, that we can be able to see and be able to resolve some of these before they happen. And at a critical moment when there is peace, and resolve them before they explode.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Lizzie, thank you so much for joining us on Panel 54 and all the insights you've given us. Hopefully we'll get you on sometime soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, peace cannot be treated as a document alone. It has to be understood as a system. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson from Ambassador Major General Gituai's career. Military strength matters. Diplomacy matters. Technology matters. But none of them can substitute for legitimacy, trust, and institutions that people believe in. So the question is not whether Africa understands conflict. We understand it too well. The question is whether we can become better at holding peace together after the first agreement is signed. You've been listening to Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If it made you pause, reflect, or reframe, share it, start a conversation, and tag us in. Find us on our social media handles at Panel54Pod and your favorite streaming platform. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep the lens clear. Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens.